Good morning guys and welcome again. In one of my previous videos I built a kid's bed and unfortunately the frame ended up being too low, which caused the slatted frame to be visible. This was not the look I was going for, so in this video I'll show you how I fixed this mistake and how I raised the height of the bed frame to hide the slats. If you ever made a mistake on a do-it-yourself project and you had to find a solution, this video is for you. Let's get started. Alright, so the first step in fixing our too low kids bed is to disassemble it and move it down to the workshop. Since the bed is quite massive, it's also quite heavy. What a fun! First, I removed all the bedding and any decorations that might got in the way. Then I took out all the screws holding the bed frame together. Once it was in pieces, it was time for the real fun. I had to maneuver the bed frame down the stairs, through the narrow hallway and into the workshop. And that was not easy in parts and sometimes a bit tight. But I always have faith in my ability to solve problems.
Stop it. Get some help.
By the way, if you want to see more of my do-it-yourself mistakes, like the video of my do-it-yourself fireball, where I set myself on fire with the angle grinder, then feel free to leave a subscription. After the bed transport workout, it was time to get to work. And what would be a better way to do that rather than with some old logs I had lying around? First things first, I cut the logs to size using my trusty but slightly shoddy miter saw. It has seen better days, but it still gets the job done. Once the logs are cut to size, it's time to break out the planer and smooth them out. My planer is a combination of a jointer and a planer from the German company Schepper. The tool is not a professional tool and is more interesting for do-it-yourselfers and has its limitations accordingly. For example, when using hardwood. Next up is the table saw, which I use to cut the logs to the right width, or height, or whatever you want to call it. The logs had the same size as the original logs which I used for the frame already. Next I tackled the logs that I had cut earlier. So I took my new awesome cordless hand router from Makita and got to work. I used a rounding bit to round off all the edges. As I was rounding off the edges, I couldn't help but think that the sound of the router reminded me of a cry of a certain animal. But I digress. After the rounding, I grabbed my old lovely Bosch orbital sander and sanded the logs up to 240. By the way, I had a total of 4 logs. As I was sanding, I noticed some cracks and holes in the logs. And I knew that I had to fix these cracks and holes if I wanted the logs to look their best. So I used black CA glue and activator spray to fill those cracks. You also can use epoxy, but then you have to wait longer before you can continue. After the glue was dry, which is done very quickly with the activator spray, I sanded it down to make the surface smooth and level. Anyways, after all that sanding and rounding, the logs were looking pretty darn good. In the next step of this woodworking adventure, I dismantled the front frame and the back frame of the bed. Now before I got started, let me just say that this was where things started to get a little tricky. First things first, I had to dismantle those little wooden slats were holding the slatted frame in place. Once the slats were out of the way, it was time to get rid of those dominoes. Now, I know some of you may have been tempted to try your hand at making your own dominoes. But trust me, it's not worth it. At least, not that way I made them in the first video. Save yourself the trouble and just use screws or buy some wooden dolls. This is also the reason why I cut my dominoes with the Japanese saw, because I used screws later on. I also cut off the inner part of the frame with the trusty Japanese saw. Now I know it may have seemed like a lot of cutting, but it was all worth it in the end. And finally I sanded away the remaining wood glue with my orbital sander. Of course I did that for both sides, the back and the front. For the new extra logs I wanted to have a connection which isn't really visible, which is why I decided to use pocket holes. However, the normal pocket holes are not big enough because they only have a diameter of about I think 8 mm. And I wanted to use larger wood screws to make sure it would withstand jumping children. So I tried to make the pocket holes by hand. For this I used a 25 mm Forstner bit and I drilled 2 holes for 1 screw. The outermost hole is slightly deeper than the first, which created a slight slant in the wood. Then I used a carving chisel with a rounded edge to create a better shape of the hole. And last but not least, I took the Dremel in hand to sand the holes to get the Grand Canyon of pocket holes. I admit the result could look better. I also slipped once or twice with the Forstner bit, which caused me to knock a few scratches into the wood. However, you won't see the pocket holes later, because the mattress will cover everything. The screws I used had a diameter of 8 mm and a length of 140 mm, so I had to pre-drill holes accordingly. Fortunately, I had such a long wooden drill, even if it was not really sharp anymore. I also used normal 6 mm screws to secure the upper plank to the lower plank. I also secured the top part of the fence with a wood screw and closed the resulting holes with self-made wooden plugs. By the way, if you like watching my fails, get out your carpenter's hammer and hit the like button. So now it was time for the finishing touch. And let me tell you, the finish can make or break a project. So I wanted to make sure to use the best of the best. And that's why I went with Rubio Monocoat, dark oak. First I cleaned and prepared the surface of the wood, making sure that it was free of dust. Then I applied the Rubio Monocoat with a brush, making sure to cover every spot of the surface evenly. As I was applying the finish, I couldn't help but think how it was bringing out the natural beauty of the wood. The dark oak color was a perfect match for the wood and it was giving it a rich and elegant look. I let the finish dry about 15 minutes before I whipped away the excess oil with a piece of cloth. The wood was now protected and had a beautiful finish, which is also food contact compliant. All in all, I have to say I'm pretty happy with how this step turned out. The Rubio Monocoat was the perfect choice for this project, and it took this piece of furniture to the next level. In the second to last step, I assembled the slats for the mattress again. While I was screwing them on, suddenly one of my bits just broke. And let me tell you, this happened to me for the first time. Usually they just get dull. And then another one. I mean... What? What the fuck? But hey, that's just the nature of woodworking. It's full of surprises, and I love it. The very last step was again the most exhausting. Of course, I had to transport the bed back to the first floor and set it up. Thanks for watching, see you next time.